Hello BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with a Friday Reads as usual. Little bit later getting to it this week. It's actually Friday afternoon here. I had thought that perhaps I wouldn't have a chance to film a Friday Reads at all this week, but as luck would have it, I was let go from work a couple hours early today. So it's about 1:45 and I'm here in my apartment with some delicious sunlight coming in the window here. It's not often this time of year. I'm home when there is sunlight streaming through the window. So last weekend I did indeed finish the Louisa May Alcott biography I said I was going to finish, Eden's Outcast by John Madison. Great biography, absolutely loved it. Definitely a biography I would recommend if you're interested in reading about Alcott. I think I've talked it to death a little bit in my past couple of Friday Reads. So I will leave it at that, just to say that I finished it, I loved it, definitely highly recommend it. Then last weekend I read Maybell Image by Simone de Beauvoir. This is the novel that I picked up secondhand last weekend, translated by, let me just double check this to make sure I get it right, translated by Patrick O'Brien. And this is a novel that was published in English initially in the first American edition in 1968, but the original French was published in 66. So this is a product of the 60s, published after her landmark work, The Second Sex, published after influential American works like The Feminine Mystique. And this novel essentially deals with what it's like to be a woman, what it's like to be that, quote, other, to deal with that traditional role, but you're longing for something more. And it's almost as though a piece of the puzzle is missing in this novel, though. I understand what Simone de Beauvoir is trying to do, but it's like there's a little something missing there that doesn't allow the novel to quite click in such a way that it says something. So we have Lawrence, who is a fairly young married woman. I would guess she's in her 30s. She does have a young daughter, but she's not all that old. She considers herself young still. She has been married for quite a few years, and she is currently engaging in an affair with a man from the office. Lawrence is in advertising, which indicates that she is well aware of the, quote, harsh realities of the world. She knows how things work. She knows how advertising and society in general tend to do things to sell you a narrative, to sell you a story. She lives in this very artificial mindset. And because of this, she is concerned with sheltering her daughter. She is concerned about her daughter knowing too much of the world, becoming disenchanted and potentially depressed by the harsh realities of the world. But she's a little off base. She's more concerned with things that would have impacted her in her own youth, in her own childhood. She lived through the Second World War, saw all that, and her daughter has been born and is growing up in a time when that's all in the past. And so in some ways she wonders what her daughter could possibly have to worry about, could possibly have to be distressed about. And so she comes to the conclusion that perhaps her daughter has seen, news reports or read newspapers or been told by an older friend about some of the wars that are still happening in the world. But as it turns out, it's not that which is depressing her daughter, which is making her daughter worried. Rather, it is this idea of, why am I alive? What is the purpose of my life? What am I supposed to do? And there's one passage, which, let me see if I can find it here. Page 29. Her daughter turns to her and says, "Mama, why do people live?" And so she sort of struggles to find an answer to this and says, "Well, people live to make each other happy. Perhaps you should talk to your father more about this. Perhaps you should talk to your grandfather about this." Because she doesn't really have an answer. So this is very much an existentialist novel. Her daughter is concerned about the meaning of her existence, and Lawrence herself is still in some ways concerned about that. She is trying to embody this middle-class working woman who is the dutiful wife, the dutiful daughter of her father. And yet she's also embodying this role as the married woman who has an affair, who is a lover. And she's having an affair with this man who is apparently very much in love with her and would like her to leave her husband. But it's almost as though she's just going through the emotions of this affair. So in many ways, it's a very interesting novel, but it didn't quite come together as a 5-star read for me. There was almost a couple of threads missing that would have tied it all together to be more impactful, perhaps. But I did really enjoy this one. Then I dipped into a bit last weekend, Flower Fables by Louisa May Alcott. This is a copy I ordered from Amazon. I'm often wary of print on demand from Amazon, but I went ahead and got this with the understanding that it's mostly poems and short stories. There actually are a few images in this, but overall it does the job. I think it was $6 or $7 on Amazon print on demand. Not a fantastic copy, but readable. So this is Alcott's first published work. It is directed towards children, and it's a series of poems and stories sort of encapsulated in this overarching narrative of these fairies who are lounging about and telling each other stories. So the first one in here that I've read was quite entertaining. A bunch of flowers in the land have been destroyed and killed by frost, and this fairy takes upon herself the task of going to the Frost King and explaining to him how much better his life will be made by having beautiful things around him and by allowing the flowers to live. And she goes about convincing this Frost King not to ravage the land and kill these flowers in an interesting way of her own. And so the entire collection is full of stories like that. I'm about halfway through. We'll probably dip into this and perhaps read the last few stories this weekend. Then I read this, this book and then this shorter work by Goethe, The Sorrows of Young Werther and Novella. The Sorrows of Young Werther was a little bit cringy to read. There's some debate as to whether it's meant to be a genuine love story, whether we're supposed to feel sympathy for Werther, or whether Goethe is showing us this reprehensible young man who is so disconnected from life that he lives in his own imagination and becomes obsessive and in fact mentally ill to the point where he is prepared to end his own life if he can't be with the woman that he claims to love. So it's a bit of a mess in that sense, but it is interesting. I wouldn't say gripping to read, but it's interesting to read the ups and downs of Werther's experience in this, quote, love affair that he's having. So it starts out with, he appears to have a little bit of money, so he's just lounging around, spending some time, going places. He doesn't really have to do any work. And off he goes to this neighborhood where someone introduces him to this young woman. A young woman who is in fact engaged. They're going to a dance and his friend says to him, "You're about to meet a young woman, but don't think about her. don't you even, because she is engaged, she's spoken for, don't be interested in her. And yet, like the idiot he is, the moment he sees her, he thinks, oh my God, she's so beautiful, I'm in love with her, just no caution, no rationality here. He's been warned, and yet he plunges headlong into unrequited love, into a literal obsession with her, an unhealthy obsession. And yet she takes him under her wing, almost as she would her brothers and sisters, who she looks after as a mother, and becomes a friend to him. She invites him to the house. He hangs out with her and her fiance, and yet he pines for her. And it's just sickening to read, because you really want him to snap out of it and stop being such an idiot. Because everything he does is really just self-destructive. It's almost as if he has no purpose in life, and so he looks for an obsessive love to give him purpose. And knowing it's going to be bad for him, he plunges headlong into it anyway, and essentially kills himself through his own obsessions. So that is The Sorrows of Young Werther. Not something I'd want to read again. Interesting concept. It's written through letters, and perhaps I think it's all letters rather than journal entries, but we're not sure exactly who all their letters are to. He's writing to a friend. He's writing to the lady in question. Interesting work, to say the least. And then I read Novella, which I didn't really get. I guess it's a certain style of German story that there is no comparison to in other languages. So it's about a prince and a princess, and they live in a grand house. There is musings about the relationship between human beings and nature in here. The prince goes off on a journey. The princess goes into town, into the market. A fire breaks out. There is a moment when she could lose her life because of what appears to be a vicious animal. And then there's some more musings about the relationship between human beings and each other, and the relationship between human beings and nature. I can't say that I really understood what Novella was all about. Not really my style of story, but interesting to read at least once, nonetheless. And then last night, I dove into Characters and Commentaries by Lytton Strachey. So I read the first 70 pages or so, where Strachey is talking about letter writing in various eras. So he begins by, let me make sure I get this right. He begins by talking about Elizabethan letter writers. Then he goes into Pope Addison, Steele, and Swift, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and Lord Chesterfield, Horace Walpole, Gray and Cooper, and the part that I'm interested in, Byron, Shelley, Keats, and Lamb. And those are really the only names that I'm familiar with, and so it's interesting to read about their letter writing styles. The one thing I notice about these chapters by Strachey, though, is that they're really a collection of sort of fragmented thoughts rather than a complete and coherent work, which I guess is what I'm going to get in this volume, given that Strachey himself did not compile these as a book themselves. Not enjoying it as much as I did Eminent Victorians, but still an interesting work to dive into. I will continue to read more of this weekend, and I do have a second biography of Louisa May Alcott that I read a couple of pages of last weekend, The Woman Behind Little Women, but I only got about 5 pages in, so I didn't think it worth talking about here again. And after that, I'm not sure what I'm going to read. I'll choose as I go. My plan, I've got to go out tonight. It's Friday. I've got to go out tonight to do a few things. But I'm actually quite looking forward to closing the door on my apartment tonight and Perhaps not opening it again until Monday morning when I go to work, because that sounds quite relaxing. We're into the bitter cold season here in Canada. Aren't really any good movies playing in the theater this weekend, and I've had my share of eating out and visiting bookshops for a while. So I think the best thing to do is just to hunker down here, do quite a bit of reading, and enjoy my weekend in that manner. In the comments below, let me know what you're up to this weekend, what you've been reading, and if you've read any of the books that I mentioned. Have a lovely weekend.